Sister Abhaya Crayle was only 21 when her body was found floating in a convent's water tank. Inspector Daya Marrow suspected foul play but was silenced. Father Jerron Vale rose to power after her death, while Mother Superior Irelia Durn carried secrets no one dared to question. Raviak Sen, the gardener who spoke up, vanished without a trace, and decades later Dr. Leora Quin uncovered evidence that exposed the truth. This is the most disturbing case India has ever seen, finally solved after 28 years. In 1992, the peaceful town of Alvera seemed like a place untouched by chaos. Known for its lush greenery and historic churches, it carried an air of serenity that outsiders admired. Hidden within its narrow lanes stood the St. Gloria Convent, a grand stone structure with towering walls, arched windows, and an air of discipline that wrapped tightly around everyone who entered its gates. Life inside the convent was governed by strict routines, where silence was valued as a form of devotion. For the young women training to become nuns, days began with prayer at dawn and ended with study and chores deep into the night. Among them was a 21-year-old Sister Abhaya Crayle. She had a reputation for being soft-spoken yet determined, a young woman whose gentle presence made her stand out in an environment that demanded conformity. On a warm March morning, the convent stirred as usual. The sisters gathered in the chapel, their voices low, hymns echoing softly against the stone walls. But as the day unfolded, one of the kitchen sisters went to fetch water from the overhead tank and made a chilling discovery. Floating lifeless in the cold, dark water was Sister Abhaya. For a moment, disbelief spread through the convent. Accidents were rare within those guarded walls. The idea that one of their own could lose her life so suddenly shattered the controlled rhythm of the institution. Panic gave way to whispers. Whispers turned into silence, and soon silence became the only response tolerated. The official account was hurriedly put together. Authorities were told that Sister Abhaya had been fetching water when she slipped and drowned. To the public it was framed as an unfortunate accident. A young nun in training had lost her life, and prayers were requested for her soul. But beneath the surface of the tidy explanation lay troubling details that many chose not to acknowledge. The water tank where she was found was heavy and difficult to access. It required strength to lift its lid. Some wondered how she managed to open it alone. Others questioned why her slippers were neatly placed outside the tank, aligned in a manner that looked deliberate rather than rushed. For those who had seen her last, nothing about her death felt natural. Abhaya had shown no signs of despair, nor had she struggled with her duties. On the contrary, she had been engaged in her lessons, eager to advance in her study. She was not the type to wander to the roof of the convent late at night or risk climbing to a place few ventured. Yet questions like these were quickly buried. The convent had a reputation to protect, and scandal was something they could not allow. The police who first examined the scene seemed uneasy. They noted how strangely calm the convent authorities were, as if prepared for the discovery. But the pressure to close the case was immense. Reports were filed stating that Abhaya's death was accidental. Within days, her body was laid to rest in the convent grounds, and the stone cross over her grave became a silent reminder of the unanswered questions surrounding her passing. For the town of Alvera, the news spread quickly, but the narrative never changed. The convent's authority was strong, and few dared to challenge it. Many townspeople lit candles in her memory, whispering prayers while quietly doubting the truth they were being asked to accept. For the sisters who lived alongside her, fear silenced their suspicion. They continued with their daily rituals, but behind closed doors, some of them carried the weight of guilt for not speaking out. Though the world moved forward, something about Sister Abhaya's death clung to the town like a shadow. Some believed it was simply God's will. Others, however, felt in their hearts that something much darker had taken place within the convent walls. As days turned into months, and months into years, the silence hardened into stone. The tragedy was locked away, but it had not been forgotten. The convent returned to its routine of hymns and prayers, yet behind every moment of quiet devotion, there lingered an unspoken truth. Sister Abhaya's death was no accident. It was a mystery waiting to be unraveled, and though buried in silence, it would one day demand to be heard. When investigators first stepped into the convent after Sister Abhaya's body was discovered, they were struck by an unsettling atmosphere. The stone corridors echoed with whispers, yet no one openly spoke about what had happened. On paper, the death had already been shaped into an accident, but small details around the scene resisted that version of events. The heavy metal lid of the water tank had been set aside as if placed there by more than one pair of hands. The floor beneath the tank was oddly clean, almost as though someone had carefully wiped it down before the police arrived. Even more peculiar were the slippers placed neatly outside the tank. For a girl supposedly rushing in the dark to fetch water, the precision with which her belongings were arranged seemed unnatural. Inspector Daya Marrow, the officer who had been assigned to the case, found the details troubling. He had handled many investigations in Alvera, and he knew how quickly rumors could spread in small towns. He made notes about the unusual placement of the slippers, the improbability of Abhaya lifting the tank lid alone, and the strange absence of any visible struggle. His instincts told him this was more than just a case of accidental drowning. Yet when he submitted his preliminary report, parts of it disappeared from the official file. The sections highlighting inconsistencies were missing, replaced with vague statements about unfortunate missteps. Soon after, the convent leaders grew restless about the investigation. They urged the authorities to finalize the case quickly. The death of a young nun in training was already unsettling for the community, and the longer it stayed in the spotlight, the more difficult it would be to preserve the convent's reputation. Pressure quietly mounted from higher offices, and whispers of influence began to circulate. Inspector Marrow felt it directly. His superiors began questioning his loyalty, urging him to treat the case as closed. He found himself caught between his duty as an officer and the power of an institution that had no tolerance for scandal. The first autopsy carried out on Sister Abhaya's body seemed to support the accident theory, but it did so too neatly. Witnesses claimed the report mentioned nothing about injuries, nothing unusual at all, but soon after, the autopsy documents disappeared from the police archive. They were said to be misfiled, but no trace of them was ever found. When Marrow attempted to recover a copy, he was told none existed. Even the hospital staff grew quiet when he pressed for answers. It was as if the entire report had been erased on purpose. Over the following weeks, strange events began to occur. Father Jerron Vale, a priest who had been close to Sister Abhaya, was suddenly transferred to a distant parish with no explanation. His removal fueled suspicion, yet it was framed as a routine. Within the convent, sisters who had been seen crying in the early days of the discovery now walked silently, their faces pale with fear. It was clear they knew more than they were saying, but the weight of silence pressed too heavily on them to speak. The town itself was unsettled. People who had admired the convent began to whisper in the markets and in their homes. Some said Sister Abhaya must have seen something she was not meant to see. Others claimed she had been punished for reasons they could only imagine. But as quickly as questions rose, they were smothered by the official stance. She drowned while fetching water. Anyone who pressed further risked ridicule or threats. For Inspector Marrow, the pressure became unbearable. Anonymous letters arrived at his home warning him to abandon the case. Once, he noticed a figure watching from the shadows outside his residence late at night. His wife pleaded with him to step back, afraid for their safety. After weeks of silence and intimidation, Marrow resigned from the force altogether. He left Alvera, never publicly speaking about Sister Abhaya's death again. With his departure, the investigation collapsed entirely. The file was marked as closed, the convent returned to its routine, and the world outside moved on. Yet for those who remembered, there was no sense of closure. Instead, the case became a story told in hushed tones, a secret buried beneath layers of power and fear. The vanishing of evidence and the silencing of voices left behind a trail of suspicion, hinting that the truth had been deliberately hidden. The convent's walls remained standing, but inside them, shadows grew longer. Each year that passed without answers made the silence more disturbing, as if the building itself was keeping a secret it refused to release. By 2004, 12 long years had passed since Sister Abhaya's lifeless body had been pulled from the convent's water tank. In Alvera, the case had become a fading memory for some, but for others, it remained a wound that never healed. Officially, it was still marked as an accident, yet the unease around it lingered like an unspoken curse. Families whispered about it over dinner tables, townsfolk avoided speaking too loudly in public, and those who dared to raise questions found themselves silent. Just when it seemed the case had been buried for good, an unexpected figure stepped forward with a revelation that threatened to tear the silence apart. Raviak Sen had once worked as a gardener within the convent ground. In his youth, he was often seen tending to the flower beds and carrying water to the kitchen, a quiet man who kept to himself. But in 2004, well after he had left his position, he broke his silence. Approaching a local journalist, Raviak admitted that on the night before Sister Abhaya's death, he had witnessed something deeply unsettling. He recalled waking in his quarters to the sound of movement near the convent ground. Peering out into the darkness, he saw two figures moving hastily across the courtyard. He could not identify them fully, but their robes and postures suggested they belonged to the convent. Their hurried behavior made an impression on him, especially when he noticed them slipping into the building near the water tank. What disturbed him more was that when he rose the next morning, the convent was unusually quiet. Hours later, news spread that Sister Abhaya's body had been discovered. Raviak connected the memory of the shadowy figures to the tragedy, but fear prevented him from speaking. The convent was powerful, its influence far-reaching. A gardener's word against theirs seemed meaningless. For years he carried the burden alone, until the weight of it became unbearable. When his account reached the authorities, there was a brief surge of hope. Perhaps this forgotten witness could reignite the investigation. Local papers reported the gardener's testimony, and murmurs of reopening the case began. But almost as quickly as hope appeared, it vanished. Within weeks, Raviak Sen himself disappeared. He was last seen leaving his small home on the outskirts of town, promising a neighbor he would return after a short errand. He never did. His belongings remained untouched, his modest savings left behind. No trace of him was ever found. The timing of his disappearance cast a heavy shadow over his claims. To some, it proved that what he had said was true, that he had seen something worth silencing. To others, it was brushed aside as coincidence. A man inventing stories who then fled when pressure mounted. Whatever the truth, his absence erased the only new lead the case had received in over a decade. Meanwhile, the convent only grew stronger. Its influence expanded through donations and connections, its leaders more respected than ever. The tragedy of Sister Abhaya was no longer a topic of open discussion. It became a cautionary tale of how quickly curiosity could turn dangerous. Families warned their children not to ask questions. Journalists who dared to revisit the story found their work rejected by editors, and investigators avoided the subject altogether. The silence deepened, like a shroud laid over the town. For Sister Abhaya's family, the pain never eased. They watched as the convent thrived while their daughter's death remained unresolved. Her grave grew weathered, the cross leaning with age, but each year they placed flowers there, refusing to let her memory fade. They wondered if the gardener's words had been his attempt at justice, cut short before it could take root. In the absence of answers, speculation filled the void. Some believed Raviak had been silenced by those who feared exposure. Others whispered that he had fled, afraid of what he had unleashed. Either way, his sudden disappearance only added to the mystery. The case that had already seemed untouchable now appeared cursed, as if anyone who touched it was doomed to vanish or fall silent. By the end of that year, the hope sparked by Raviak's testimony was extinguished. The case once again slid into obscurity, locked away by fear and power. The gardener's voice was gone, but his shadow lingered. People in Alvera still remembered his final words, his account of figures moving in the dark, and it gnawed at them in secret. The story of Sister Abhaya was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a chilling reminder of how truth could be buried, not by time alone, but by the deliberate hands of those determined to keep it hidden. In 2015, the name Sister Abhaya resurfaced when most of Alvera had accepted that the case would remain unsolved forever. It happened almost by accident, when a retired forensic expert named Dr. Leora Quin began sorting through decades-old archives. She had spent much of her life analyzing medical evidence for criminal cases, and now, in retirement, she dedicated her time to studying forgotten files. In a dusty collection of boxes, stored in a government facility, she stumbled upon something startling, a set of photographs from an autopsy conducted on Sister Abhaya in 19. The images had been tucked away, unmarked, as though someone had deliberately hidden them. What she saw in those photographs shattered the long-standing narrative of an accident. The images showed distinct injuries to the head, bruises and cuts that were impossible to explain through a fall into a water tank. The markings were consistent with blunt force trauma, a deliberate strike rather than a misstep. Dr. Quin knew instantly that this was no drowning. Someone had attacked Sister Abhaya before her body was placed in the water. For years, the official reports had claimed there were no unusual injuries, no evidence of foul play. Yet the photographs told an entirely different story. The presence of these images meant that someone had known the truth all along, but had buried it beneath a carefully constructed lie. For Dr. Quin, the discovery was both thrilling and terrifying. She realized she was holding evidence that could expose decades of silence, but it also meant challenging powerful institutions that had successfully smothered the case for nearly 3 decades. Her findings eventually reached a small investigative team, determined to break the silence surrounding the convent. They began piecing together fragments of testimony, faded records, and rumors that had circulated over the years. Patterns began to emerge. Among those patterns were names that appeared again and again, people present at the convent during the night of the tragedy. 2 figures in particular stood out: Father Jerron Vale and Mother Superior Irelia Durn. Both had been influential at St. Gloria Convent. Both had risen in rank after Abhaya's death, and both were known to have been near the kitchen and courtyard that night. As the investigators dug deeper, disturbing rumors resurfaced. Whispers suggested that Sister Abhaya had stumbled upon something forbidden, something that could destroy reputation. Some accounts hinted she might have witnessed an encounter between Father Jerron and Mother Irelia, a meeting that broke the strict vows of celibacy and obedience within the convent's sacred walls. If Abhaya had seen them together, she would have become a threat to their positions, their vows, and the institution's carefully cultivated image. The idea that her silence had been forced rather than chosen began to take shape as the most plausible explanation. The evidence uncovered by Dr. Quin gave the case momentum it had never enjoyed before. Still, reopening the investigation after so many years was not easy. Documents had vanished, witnesses had died or disappeared, and memories had faded, but the photographs were undeniable. They painted a story that contradicted everything the convent had claimed. With this, the investigators gained the courage to push further, even as resistance grew. Legal petitions were filed, media outlets cautiously revisited the tragedy, and whispers turned into questions that could no longer be ignored. The convent, once untouchable, began to show cracks. Those who had defended the accident theory grew defensive, their answers vague and evasive. The families of other sisters recalled strange moments in the days following Abhaya's death: hallways scrubbed at odd hours, restricted access to certain areas, and sudden transfers of those who had asked too many questions. Each recollection added fuel to the suspicion that this had been a carefully orchestrated cover-up. The most haunting element was how long the truth had remained buried. Nearly 23 years had passed before the photographs came to light, and in that time, countless opportunities for justice had been smothered. For Abhaya's family, the news was devastating and vindicating at the same time. They had always believed she did not simply drown, and now proof supported their conviction. But it also reopened old wounds,
reminding them of how their daughter's life had been treated as expendable in the name of protecting power. The investigation shifted from being a forgotten tragedy to a national scandal. The question was no longer whether Sister Abhaya's death had been an accident. It was who had silenced her and how they had managed to escape accountability for so long. The presence of Father Jerron Vale and Mother Superior Irelia Durn at the heart of the suspicions made the case even more explosive. They were not just individuals. They represented authority, faith, and trust in the community. The thought that they could have been involved in such a crime was almost unbearable, yet the evidence pointed in their direction. The photographs had cracked open a wall of silence, and for the first time in decades the possibility of truth seemed within reach. But with every step forward, came renewed danger. Files went missing again, witnesses were threatened, and the investigators themselves received warnings to abandon the case. Still, the momentum had shifted. Once the photographs were public, there was no turning back. What began as an overlooked discovery in a dusty archive was about to ignite a firestorm that would drag the truth into the open after 28 years of shadow. In 2020, 28 years after the discovery of Sister Abhaya's body in the convent water tank, the truth that had been buried under decades of silence finally emerged. The courtroom in Alvera was packed, every seat filled with journalists, townspeople and families who had carried the memory of the case for a lifetime. For many it was hard to believe that justice might actually be served after so long. The trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It was the final chapter of a story that had haunted an entire community, one that had eroded trust in institutions, meant to protect innocence. The prosecution presented the photographs uncovered years earlier by Dr. Leora Quin, images that revealed blunt force trauma on Sister Abhaya's head. Experts testified that the injuries were consistent with deliberate blows, and could not have been caused by falling into a water tank. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as each image was projected, a haunting reminder of how long the truth had been suppressed. Alongside the photographs came fragments of witness testimony, old records that survived attempts at erasure, and reports of suspicious behavior from the night of her death. The defense tried to argue that memories had faded, that evidence was too old to be reliable, that the narrative had been twisted by those seeking attention. Yet the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The investigation team revealed a chain of secrecy that led directly to two figures who had long been suspected: Father Jerron Vale and Mother Superior Irelia Durn. Both had been present at the convent the night Abhaya died. Both had risen in rank after her death, and both had remained shielded by the institution's silence for decades. The accusations against them were devastating. The prosecution argued that Sister Abhaya had stumbled upon something forbidden, an illicit meeting between Father Jerron and Mother Irelia. Their vows of celibacy and devotion left no room for such behavior, and exposure could have ruined their reputations and career. Faced with the possibility that Abhaya might reveal what she had seen, they struck her in panic and desperation, silencing her before she could speak. To hide the crime, they placed her body in the water tank, creating the illusion of an accident. The cover-up that followed, vanished autopsy files, silenced witnesses, and sudden transfers, was all part of a system determined to protect its own. For the people of Alvera, hearing the story laid out so clearly was both shocking and affirming. For years they had whispered about the possibility of foul play, but few dared to believe such respected figures could be responsible for something so cruel. The trial stripped away that illusion, revealing the extent to which power had been abused and truth manipulated. As testimony unfolded, the memory of Raviak Sen, the gardener who had disappeared after sharing what he saw, resurfaced. Though he was never found, his account of shadowy figures moving near the convent courtyard aligned with the timeline of events. His absence became a silent witness of its own, a reminder of how dangerous it had been to speak out. Inspector Daya Marrow's resignation, years earlier, also took on new meaning. His notes, though incomplete, hinted that he had recognized the truth before being forced into silence. Each piece of the puzzle revealed not only the crime, but the deliberate efforts to bury it. After weeks of arguments and examination, the verdict was delivered. Father Jerron Vale and Mother Superior Irelia Durn, were both found guilty of murder, and the announcement sent a wave of emotion through the courtroom. Some gasped, some wept, and others sat in stunned silence, struggling to process that justice had finally arrived. After nearly 3 decades, for Sister Abhaya's family, it was a bittersweet moment. They had spent half a lifetime waiting for the truth, enduring ridicule, silence and despair. The guilty verdict validated what they had always believed. Their daughter had not drowned by accident, she had been murdered. The conviction sent ripples across India. It was one of the longest unresolved cases in the nation's history, and its conclusion exposed the fragility of truth in the face of power. The case became a cautionary tale, not just of a young life cut short, but of how institutions designed to guide faith and morality could be corrupted by fear and ambition. It reminded people that silence, when imposed by force, only prolongs injustice. Even as justice was served, the legacy of the case remained heavy. The convent never fully recovered its reputation, its towering walls now symbols of secrecy, rather than sanctity. The townspeople of Alvera continued to speak of Sister Abhaya in hushed voices, her name forever tied to the shadowed history of the place. Flowers were laid at her grave once more, this time with the knowledge that her story had been heard, her truth finally acknowledged. Sister Abhaya's case became etched in history, as one of the most disturbing examples of how long justice can take, when the powerful work to conceal the truth, but it also stood as proof that silence, no matter how carefully maintained, can eventually be broken. After 28 years, the truth that had been hidden within stone walls was dragged into the light, and the voice of a young woman silenced in 1992 finally spoke through the